Welcome to the Advanced Plans Committee of the Metropolitan Area Planning Commission. This is Thursday, August 10th, and I would like to call this meeting to order. So on the agenda, we can't approve any minutes at this point until we get a quorum. I think we will move on to item number 3 then, which is Scott Wadle is going to give a update on the proposed 2024 department budget.
Yeah, thank you. I'll just do it from here, and it's just going to be really brief. I just wanted to touch base with you as we're going through the budget process for both the city and the county. Of course, because we're a joint department, our department depends on what gets approved at that level. I just wanted to check in to let you know where we are with it. And as far as our funding stream from both the city and the county looks to be stable, in fact, increasing slightly. And that is something that we covered as we did the initial presentation on this. The couple of things that I wanted to highlight that are new would be that there has been funding programmed from both the city and the county to look at review parking and the parking requirements that are in the zoning code. And we've seen a number of zoning cases that have come in just strictly to address parking. So this would be an opportunity for us to look at that in a more comprehensive manner. So that's a pretty exciting thing that we've been able to, that we're seeing progress through the process. Now, of course, the budget processes are not complete. There's still a number of steps to be done, namely public hearings at both the city council and the county commission level. But just wanted to check in with you and let you know about that. The other one that's looks like it's going to be approved or recommended for approval would be the temporary caseload support, which is what we use to bring in other temporary help to help us out with some of the cases. And so Bill Longnecker is an example of that, where he came in and helped us out with a number of staff reports earlier. And it's been something that we've been doing for a number of years, but every year we have to, we make a request to re-up that. And we've been fortunate so far with that. So that's the update. Are there any questions or any other information that would be helpful?
Excuse me, I'm advised that we have Cindy Miles online right now. So we do have a quorum, and I'm going to back up and do a roll call. Duell is here. Warren is absent. Joe Johnson here. Hugh Nix is absent. Hartman is not here. He's absent. Miles.
I'm here.
Miles is here. McKay. Here. We have a quorum. So therefore, I would ask for approval of the previous meeting minutes.
So move. Second.
Any further discussion? If not, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, the same sign. Motion carries. Thank you. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the places for people implementation, which is probably the main thing that we're going to be considering or discussing today. We are honored to have Troy Anderson, the Assistant City Manager, with us, who will provide the presentation.
Okay, fair enough. Well, first of all, thank you for having me here today. As indicated, my name is Troy Anderson, Assistant City Manager. And so this is a presentation that we recently made to City Council as part of a workshop. This is as you can kind of see here in front of you, this is a convergence of a couple of different conversations. And then that way we can kind of carry this on in sort of just one conversation. But previously, there were some conversations around the Affordable Housing Fund and questions around the Affordable Housing Fund. There were questions about the urban infill program and whether or not we're seeing any success in that regard. There was also a conversation around the city's facade improvement program and retooling that. And what I'd like to demonstrate is that these really sort of all fall within one conversation. So next slide. So the Affordable Housing Fund, more specifically back in January of 22, AHCS, the Housing Community Service Department, presented an Affordable Housing Fund implementation fund to City Council. And as part of that, City Council allocated $5 million from the American Rescue Plan Act funds that were received as a result of a U.S. Treasury final rule for ARPA Fiscal Recovery Fund. We have better understood and identified how we can use those funds. So we have recently done some revisions to the Affordable Housing Fund Implementation Program plan. There was a conversation around geographic focus, eligible users, funding caps, beneficiaries. More particularly, though, the Wichita Housing Authority homes. Ultimately, the $5 million, the bulk of it will go to the disposition of a number of these Wichita Housing Authority single-family residences. There are significant improvements that need to be made in order to dispose of them from the housing authority's inventory and get them back out into the private sector. And this is going to be somewhat of an ongoing theme around preservation of existing housing stock. Next slide. So as you can see on the slide in front of you, right, that this shows a number of those, some 350 scattered single-family residential housing sites that the housing authority is in the process of trying to dispose of. Next slide. This just shows that as part of the first group of homes that are in process of being sold, there's about 37 homes. It's got about a $2.5 million assessed value on all those homes combined. And we are going through the process of disposing those through the city's real estate division. That's the first group. Next slide. Sure.
Excuse me. So were those properties acquired through tax sales, or how did the city come to own those?
Boy, that's a great question. I don't have the answer for it. I would imagine that the city acquired those properties in any number of different ways. Usually, no, we are not acquiring properties through tax sale. We may have acquired them through acquisition. We may have acquired them through donation. We may have acquired them from tax sale, but generally, no, we're not going to tax sale to try to acquire properties. So the second group, there are actually two subgroups. There will be some RFPs coming out. There are two clusters, right? The first group is truly sort of a scattered site. The next group are two clusters. There's one cluster around Haskell and St. Clair, and another cluster around Minnesota and 25th. And so as we dispose of these clusters, right, again, there's an opportunity for us to, as we get proposals from respondents to the RFPs to acquire these properties, we can combine that with the Affordable Housing Fund dollars to bring these properties up to code and prep them for sale to the private market. Next slide. this just kind of goes and shows there was always kind of some question around, well, we've got this $5 million fund out there, right? How are we using that to create more affordability in and around our housing market, right? Well, as you can see here, if we spent, according to the plan, there's a $40,000 cap associated with each property, right? So an applicant can receive up to $40,000 per property to renovate those homes in order to get them ready for either sale to other private property owners or for preparation to make them rental properties. And so if you took those 40,000 across 66 homes, you're looking at $2.6 million of the $5 million that could get absorbed fairly quickly, leaving only about $2.3 million left in the fund. Next slide. So additionally, as part of that affordable housing fund, right, there was an offer up of not just that the affordable housing fund can go to those properties as part of the disposition, right, but also properties within a quarter mile, right? So we anticipate that sort of that domino effect, what we'll call here shortly adjacency momentum, right? That if we're seeing these 66 properties being rehabbed, could we also see a number of other properties in the area getting rehabbed and continue to increase property values in the area and create a domino effect? So we anticipate that within a quarter mile of these two clusters, if you had property owners take advantage of some of these dollars to perhaps do a re-roof or make improvements to their properties pretty quickly within each of those, if you assumed $500,000 to property owners within a quarter mile, another $1 million from the fund, that leaves only about $1.3 million left in the affordable housing fund. Next slide. So that was part of the first conversation, right? That there was some question around, have we forgotten about this affordable housing fund? No, we haven't forgotten about this affordable housing fund, right? We continue to remain diligent that the affordable housing fund is going to be used to create affordable housing in our urban core. Again, kind of a recurring theme around that, of preservation of existing housing stock. So then there was another conversation that was introduced, and that was around urban infill, right? So back in August of 22, there was an urban infill program that was introduced, and it included fee waivers and expense reimbursements in formative areas. That went into effect Q4 of 2022. And so we have since been continuing to monitor whether or not that incentive is resulting in urban infill. And I emphasize urban infill in the sense that it's different than preservation of existing housing stock, right? So the question is this program inducing urban infill? Next slide. This map just showed the formative areas where this program was constituted. Next slide. So, as I indicated, we dove into somewhat of the analytics around the activity associated with those permits in these formative areas, right? And we looked back over the last 5 years and tried to see if there was a trend line or an increase in activity. And on first blush, right, you look at this and you see that in 2023, there was a spike in activity, right? Q4 of 22 and on into Q1 and Q2 of 23, there was a huge spike in not only permit activity, but also property valuation. Unfortunately, this is a little misleading, right? As we continue to dive into the numbers, next slide. What you'll see is actually there were 2 permits that skewed this activity. There were 2 multifamily residential projects that were permitted in Q4 of 2022. There was a project at 1750 North Harvard and a project at 1728 North Fairmont, valued at about $12.8 million, that skewed those results. So as you look at sort of the stack in the last column there, what you actually see are, well, we did see a slight increase of single family. We saw a decrease of 2 family. While there was an increase in permit activity, again, the valuation that was added over those 3 quarters actually went down if you take out those 2 outliers, those 2 multifamily residential projects. The reason why we present it like that is because those 2 multifamily residential projects would had to have been conceived and in the process long before the city ever constituted this incentive program. So there's no way that the incentive program could have been the cause for these 2 projects. Next slide. Actually, can we go back for just a second? What we did notice though is that, the point down there at the bottom, the infill development versus preservation. What we did notice though was, as you see the increase in permit activity, what we did see is a number of permits being pulled for existing properties, right? We saw folks taking advantage of, again, preservation of existing housing stock. They were replacing water heaters. They were making improvements to their property, right, to maintain the properties that are already in existence. We didn't see that this led to infill, but what we did see was an interesting correlation between this and preservation of the existing housing stock. Okay, next slide. Yes, sir.
The spike in the apartments over by Wichita State,
Yes.
with the result of the, what's the program, the federal program that Wichita State area is involved in? What's it called, Scott?
Man, that's a great question. I don't know. These are properties on the south side of the campus. These are private sector sort of apartments. Yeah, I'm not sure what, I mean, short of student. Sure, yes, short of student body increase and. Yes. Possibly, yeah, I don't know, but it definitely wasn't the urban infill program that the city constituted last fall. Okay, so how does this play out, right? We kind of go down the path of these goals and objectives that the city has set forth. We start with, at the very basic level, the city's comprehensive plan, the community events plan, 2015 to 2035, lays out future land use policies. And more specifically, as part of that, there's an urban infill strategy, right? So if the urban infill program is not inducing the urban infill that we're looking for, we kind of have to go back to the drawing board and figure out what does our urban infill strategy suggest for us, right? So as part of that urban infill strategy, that led to Wichita's Places for People and the comprehensive plan amendment. Next slide. So if you look at that Places for People comprehensive plan amendment, there were some really interesting concepts that were daylighted as a result of that, right? The first one is this neighborhood investment framework. And as you can see on the slide, the top right, where it says 1, 2, 3, you sort of see this transition, right, between free market and what free market investment does to neighborhood investment, what adjacency momentum does and what that looks like for neighborhood investment, and then ultimately how that leads to community development, community redevelopment, right? The adjacency momentum is the one that I really want to emphasize here, right? When we start looking at the connection between free market and true community development, redevelopment, we can't skip over adjacency momentum, right? It becomes exponentially more difficult to create community development and redevelopment without taking advantage of what we are seeing in the free market. So again, I want to continue to kind of emphasize this adjacency momentum throughout this presentation. Next slide. So the next one is same page out of the places for people. Down on the bottom right, you'll see this evolution of revitalizing neighborhoods, right? Areas that are formative are those areas that that are of the greatest need, right? Now they're starting to see some investment, they're starting to emerge, and then they continue to see investment and redevelopment. Now we're flourishing. And then what you're hoping for is ultimately a neighborhood that is, according to the terms here, maturing, right? That is, it's not in any need of ongoing subsistence or investment, that it's on a trajectory to continue to mature into a neighborhood that we're all kind of hoping that it will. What I want to point out here is that in order to get to maturing, right, we can't dismiss those two middle, which is really where a lot of adjacency momentum occurs, right? In those emergency and flourishing. Maturing is seeing private sector investment, free market investment, right? That's where we hope all of this ultimately lands, right? But from the city's perspective, when we're talking about incentive programs and subsidizing and those kind of things, maturing removes local government, right? And this is total free market. In order to get from formative to free to maturing, we've got to go through these emerging and flourishing, and this is where adjacency momentum occurs. Next slide. Also, as part of that Places for People plan, right? It wasn't just neighborhoods, right? In fact, as part of that Places for People plan, right, there was a suggestion of where and how investment could occur to address those things like adjacency momentum and emerging and other areas that could see investment, right? The one I really want to focus though on is we begin to kind of start having this conversation around, is it neighborhoods or are we really talking about nodes and corridors, right? And as you can see here on this illustration, it's a combination of both, right? When the city constituted the urban infill strategy last fall, there was a focus on these formative areas, these formative neighborhoods, right? And where we're actually seeing a lot of the free market adjacency and momentum occur is surprisingly in nodes and corridors, right? That's really where you're going to see a lot of. So it's a blended approach. And so as we move forward in kind of rethinking what it is we're trying to accomplish, we want to make sure that we're not dismissing those nodes and corridors. Next slide. So I actually went out and kind of pulled some very specific strategies and targets from that Places for People. And I'm going to read through some of these here because some of them were pretty eye-opening, right? That there's sort of it's really easy to say things like, you know what, our community, we need more affordable housing. We need more affordable housing. We need more affordable housing, right? Well, what does that mean, right? And we need more single family residential, or we need more duplexes, right? That I think I'm kind of going to dispel a little bit in some of those nuances, right? So first of all, one of the strategy number 4 was to create tools and target incentives to cause infill and redevelopment to occur in desired areas, right? And that's what we've all been trying to accomplish, right? But did we hit the mark? Strategy number 5, provide a diversity of housing options to attract new residents and allow existing residents to remain in the ECA. A diversity of housing options, right? Again, as you'll see later in it's not just about single family and two family residences, right? That's not the diversity of housing options that we're talking. There's a whole spectrum of housing types that exist out there that we could be better responding to respond to the wants and desires and needs of our housing markets. Strategy number 6, encourage infill and redevelopment that is contextual to the environment in which it is occurring. So one of the things that we keep coming back to too is infill development in the urban core, in the ECA is what the Places for People calls it, right? Looks wildly different than development outside of the ECA in the suburbs, right? And so a single family, two family product that works well out in the suburbs may not necessarily work well in the ECA, right? And so Places for People recognize that, right? That as we think about infill development and as we think about redevelopment within our ECA, that infill, that redevelopment has to be contextual to the environment which is occurring. It has to be architecturally sensitive to the surrounding neighborhoods, right? And so that's going to be one of the key things that we continue to emphasize throughout this, that, you know, as we bring incentives to the table to help encourage and promote urban infill and urban redevelopment, we don't want to dismiss the fact that these areas have to be contextual to the environment in which they're occurring. Okay, so those are some of the strategies. So some of the targets, I found this one really fascinating. Target number 5 is create 350 new net housing units within the ECA annually. It says housing units, right? It doesn't say single family residential homes, doesn't say duplexes, just says housing units. It says provide a mix of predominantly market rate units with some subsidized units and a mixture of types, including 2/3 multifamily units. 2/3 of those 350 new housing units each year in the ECA as a target should be multifamily, comprised of row houses, small scale walk-ups and flats, and only 1/3 of the single family infill and redevelopment. The reason why I point that out is because if we're going to be sensitive to the neighborhood, if we're going to be contextual to the environment in which it's occurring, where are you most likely going to see that? You're most likely going to see that in nodes and corridors, right? We're not going to take a large multifamily residential project and put it in the middle of a traditionally single family residential neighborhood, right? That doesn't work. But the other emphasis here is it's got to be a combination of both. It's not just affordable housing, as I'm going to kind of allude to here in a little bit. It's market rate, right? This is a macroeconomics conversation, right? Supply and demand. The more supply that we can create, the market will dictate affordability, right? And so how do we continue to grow and encourage investment in our ECA around housing in particular? And then the last target 7 was use 85% of incentives. I'm actually going to kind of encourage that we use 100% of our incentives. You know, we have a real housing need in our community, and rather than trying to throttle back our incentives, my recommendation is we need to bring the entire toolbox and arguably maybe to the kitchen sink to a number of these projects. It is becoming exponentially more difficult for residential housing projects to occur with rising cost of construction, access to labor, inflation, and with all of that, if we're not bringing 100% of our incentives to the table, these projects don't pencil out, or they pencil themselves out of the market, right? So next slide. Yes.
On number 5 target,
Go back.
by the description of that, so if 2/3 of it is to be a multifamily of some sort, are you targeting federal subsidies, federal money coming into that? Is Section 8 housing still around?
So that's a great question. And here in a couple of slides, I'm actually going to start to dissect that conversation, right? Because this begins to be a conversation where we have to separate the terms. Affordable housing, as we use it, is a different conversation than housing that's affordable, right? If you're talking about federal subsidies, that's a conversation around affordable housing, right? That there are low-income housing tax credits, that there are voucher-based programs, that there is Section 8 housing, right? That's a different conversation than perhaps what a lot of folks might appreciate is just housing that's affordable, right? I don't need a project-based voucher. I don't need Section 8. I just need housing that's affordable. And I'll show you kind of why we're trying to say those conversations differently, but I'll get to that in just a second. Next slide. Okay, so as a follow-up to Places for People, back in December of 2020, we reached out to Development Strategies, which is a group, and they did an analysis around node prioritization, right? They went through this node prioritization exercise. They assessed each of the 29 nodes within the ECA, and they came out with a ranking and investment category sort of opportunity matrix, right? Initially, they started out with, hey, here's our top 10. Then they added a market and economic and community development component, right? So not just here's our top 10, but perhaps here's where we're seeing a lot of market and economic influence, right? And then they sort of recreated a top 10. And then they added a third component. They added an equity component. And as a result, they came out with sort of their final rankings. They said it basically, if the city wants to invest in and around nodes, right? Here's an opportunity for where we think those nodes might be most appropriate, right? The interesting part that I want to point out about this, right, is if you look at a number of these nodes, if you look at the neighborhood cycle and the investment category next to it, they're not all informative neighborhoods, right? Some of them are informative and emerging. Some are in maturing and emerging, right? So you can't just look at one neighborhood type and think of this is the classic financial. You want a diversified portfolio, right? We want to try to approach this and we want to really kind of take advantage of adjacency momentum. So we took a look at these corridors and next slide. In concert with the previous illustration that I showed you, next slide, we created sort of a shift away from the formative neighborhoods to more of a node and corridor approach to take advantage of that adjacency momentum where we're already seeing free market investment. How do we come alongside that free market investment and we really start changing how these neighborhoods are being invested in? So you can see here the similarities to how we're approaching these nodes and corridors similarly to the previous illustration that you saw. And we're going to try to start maybe shifting our focus away from just the neighborhood approach to coming alongside free market and investing in areas in nodes and corridors. Next slide. Again, geography is only half of the equation though, right? Coming back to that 85% or 100%, the incentives are something else that we have to take a look at, right? We have a number of incentive types. We have a number of incentive programs. One of the emphasis that we want to continue to place on this is that as the city comes alongside and encourages investment, the incentives that we're bringing to the table have to be performance-based, right? They have to be based on the value add that is, we're not just going to hand out cash, right? There's got to be this idea that, hey, look, we're going to come alongside and we're going to help close the gap. We're going to help try to fill the hole of that delta, but it's got to be performance. You got to go do the project, right? You got to go do the project first. And if you go do the project, there are incentives that help make that project a reality. And it's got to be net positive to the community, obviously, right? Next slide. Which leads into sort of the third convergence, the third conversation that we've been having, right? So back in November of 2022, we had a presentation to City Council about just one of our incentives, right? We have a facade improvement program that is based around special assessments. There's a geographical limitation associated with it. And arguably, it is based on a very loose, very liberal interpretation of a very specific state statute. And as we really kind of looked at our toolbox, right, we said, does that continue to make sense? Number one, that program had the special assessment, but there was also a grant forgiveness aspect of that component, right? So as we dove into the history of that program, we found no substantial correlation between the grant offering that was being given. I think there was up to like $30,000 that could be forgiven for folks participating in the program. Folks weren't participating in the program because we were given a $30,000 grant away, right? They were investing in the program because they could use special assessments and they could use the reduced interest rates associated with it, right? So we kind of approached City Council and said, it doesn't make any sense for us to continue to kind of throw these grant offerings at these projects. That's not the incentive of why these. So why are these people, they're using special assessments? Well, we have another tool in the toolbox that offers the same thing. In fact, it has not only the same offering, but it's actually a better tool. The facade improvement program was limited to the facade that was adjacent to the right of way. So if a building has 4 sides, the other 3 sides, unless you were on a corny lot, were not eligible for this facade improvement program. However, under the community improvement district law, right, under a CID, you can use special assessment for all sides of a building. In fact, there's a whole host of other eligible expenses associated with CID that you can take advantage of special assessments. Additionally, the CID program can also be used in conjunction with a sales tax, right? So our suggestion back in November was that we should retool, and rather than continuing to use our facade improvement program, that we should bolster our community improvement CID program tool in the toolbox. And again, focus it on those geographic areas such as downtown, such as nodes and corridors, right? So that we can align our efforts between geography and incentives. Next slide. And this is a prime example of one of those projects, right? This is an artistic rendering. It's not a real project, right? But this is a prime example of how that can work, right? So on a project like this, might be a rehab, might be new construction, right? The community improvement district will allow for special assessments, not just for the 2 elevations that are adjacent to the right of way, right? But common areas or public parking, or again, a whole slew of other eligible expenses. If this project were a mixed use project where you had multifamily residential above and you had a retail on the ground floor, now the sales tax, the additional sales tax that's being generated by that retail establishment can also go back into the project to help close the gap associated with making a project like this pencil out. Next slide. Another tool we have in our toolbox, right? Industrial revenue bonds. This is a great tool. Has 2 components, has a sales tax exemption component. That sales tax exemption can be used on not only the construction costs, but also furniture, fixtures, and equipment, right? So things like, for example, a hotel that outfits their entire hotel with beds and furniture and all that, all of the sales tax associated with that project can be exempt under an industrial revenue bond. There's also a second component to that, a property tax exemption, right? And when we start talking about housing, for whatever reason, historically, the city has shied away from using industrial revenue bonds and property tax exemption as it relates to housing, right? But here's a great opportunity to create a property tax exemption. It's eligible under the federal tax code, right? That can help drive down rents for the property, where a property owner is not having to pay property taxes potentially for the first 10 years, right? And that can be structured on any sort of gradient. But again, just maximizing and utilizing the tools we already have in our toolbox can continue to encourage and promote infill development, particularly housing in our urban core. And we can help drive down market rents to create more housing that is affordable. One of the things we want to make sure that we continue to emphasize throughout all of this, right, is because we've had a number of conversations with taxing jurisdictions, particularly USD 259, right? We don't want to take away from any of the taxing jurisdictions to make this happen, right? We continue to want to try to make all of those taxing jurisdictions whole. So as part of all of this structure, which I'll get to here in just a minute, is similar to a TIF model, right? Where there's a base value, whether it's a pilot payment in lieu of taxes, or it's an origination fee, whatever that is, right? All of these projects will have a pass through that all of the taxing jurisdictions continue to remain whole as if the project never occurred, right? And again, I'll show you on our TIF model what that actually looks like in greater detail, but that's where I think we continue to get buy-in from a number of these taxing jurisdictions to unshackle our incentives, use the full, but we can always implement things like pilots and origination fees and those kind of things to continue to make taxing jurisdictions whole, knowing that at the end, once these incentives fall off, for example, the 10-year property tax exemption, year 11, there's a huge windfall of revenue coming into all of these taxing jurisdictions, which help broaden the tax base, grow the community, keep property taxes and sales taxes low, so on and so forth. Next slide. So along that same line, right, we have another tool in our toolbox. It's called Neighborhood Revitalization Area. This was a tool that had been used by the city historically, and for whatever reason, was discontinued. It takes buy-in from all of the taxing jurisdictions, right? But basically, and this was probably more associated with preservation of existing housing stock rather than infill. But however, this is a tool that we're really trying to reconstitute. We're having a lot of really good conversations with USD 259. But basically what happens is as improvements are being made to properties, right, that that the value that is being created, that the increase in property taxes that is being realized as a result of investment can come back to those property owners through a rebate, through a property tax rebate from the school, from all the taxing jurisdictions, school, county, city. And so we're hoping to really reintroduce this tool back into our toolbox here in the near future. Again, there will be a pilot, there will be an origination fee so that all those taxing, it's only the performance-based value add that is added that allows for these rebates or the exceptions to come back to the owners and developers. Next slide. And obviously TIF, right? You all have heard of this, tax income financing. But this illustration really kind of becomes the illustration for all of the incentives that I just described, right? So the area in orange, right, is the tax value that is continued to be realized by all the taxing jurisdictions from the beginning of the redevelopment or blighted property. A property has a property value and the taxes that are associated with it at that time. Well, as the redevelopment occurs or the infill development occurs, you see that blue line shows the increase in value and subsequently the increase in tax obligation associated with it, right? So over a period of time, you see that from beginning to end, The area in green is that property tax obligation that is a result of the value that can come back as part of the investment. In orange, all the taxing jurisdictions continue to be made whole. And at the end of the repayment obligation, right, these don't run in perpetuity. They have shelf lives, 10, 15, 20 years, depending on the tool. At the end, you see the huge windfall of revenue going out to all of the taxing jurisdictions. So this is the model. I know it says tax income and financing on it, but similar to NRA, similar to CID, similar to all of those other tools. This is how we want to structure a lot of our programs and offerings. It's performance-based. It's value add based, right? You got to go out and do the project, but there's an opportunity for you to kind of close the gap in making these projects a reality. Next slide. And then obviously we always have this tool in our toolbox, right? Fee waivers and expense reimbursements, which is the tool that we used back in 2022 for urban infill. We kind of saw how that played out. Next slide. So this is where we kind of really take a long, hard look at our incentive types. We have property tax exemptions, we have property tax rebate, we have sales tax exemption, we have sales tax rebate, we have special. Next slide. Here's those tools, right? CID, IRB, NRA, TIF, SA. Next slide. And this kind of just shows kind of the matrix of how this all plays out, right? So as we're approaching every project, one tool might be appropriate for one project where another tool might be appropriate for another project, right? So for example, special assessment may not necessarily be appropriate for most multifamily residential projects, right? Because what happens is with the special assessment, on top of your mortgage and interest and all of that kind of stuff, you're having to pay a special assessment, right? Well, if you're going to pass that cost on to your tenants, special assessments work really well in a triple net lease on a non-residential project. Doesn't make a lot of sense in a multifamily because now you're increasing your rents, right? And now you may be increasing your rents, you may be pricing yourself out of the market, right? So every project requires a little bit of nuance, but that kind of gives you an idea. Along the top, you see there property tax exemption, property tax rebate. So like a CID offers a sales tax rebate and a special assessment. An IRB offers a property tax exemption and a sales tax, so on and so forth. Next slide. So as we understand at least the tools in our toolbox, right, then we kind of start thinking to ourselves, okay, where do we invest, right? What's our investment strategy? This was a slide that came right out of Places for People, right? And you'll notice there the investment dollars across time. For catalyst sites and for incubation, you see a lot of investment in the public realm, a lot of catalyst projects where you see in the dollar, you see a lot of public investment, right? A lot of public dollars being invested into these projects. But over time, what you see where you get into those self-sufficiency and contributor projects and neighborhoods, right? This is almost an exact reflection of what we showed a little while ago, right? Of from formative to maturing, right? That eventually the free market takes over, private investment takes over, and cities can go and invest in other areas. This is a prime example of adjacency momentum. Next slide. Okay, so we have talked about public investment. We primarily talked about residential, but this is also applicable to commercial. We've talked about housing price, right? A little bit. I'm actually going to go into greater detail here in just a minute, but separating the difference between affordable housing and housing affordability. Talk about housing stock. Is it new construction or is it preservation of existing housing stock? And then I'll get into a little bit here about housing type, low density versus high density. So when we're talking about public investment, these are the things we also need to consider. Next slide. So let's talk about affordable housing versus housing affordability. Next slide. And I kind of alluded to this a little bit ago, but when we talk about affordable housing, we talk about funds that are made available through the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. We talk about area median incomes. We talk about fair market rents, talk about low income housing tax credits. We talk about housing that's basically subsidized, right? That's different than housing affordability, right? Housing affordability, we're talking about housing, household income and household expenses. What percentage of your income is going towards your mortgage or your rent, right? There's actually a housing affordability index out there talking about market rents, right? Next slide. So we're going to try to differentiate here the difference between affordable housing and housing affordability. And we actually start looking into some of the numbers, right? This came out of the 2021 Kansas statewide housing assessment. And this is a really interesting page out of that. The next couple of slides, I'm going to go into greater detail on the illustration here, but basically what this is showing is that there is a surplus of housing stock attainable to income groups in the 25 to 75,000 a year household income sector. The bar that you see that down there, we're using the 2023 median in family income of $85,100. Where the gaps really are, we'll show you here in just a second. The housing gap is really in the under 25,000, right? So if you've got a household income of less than $25,000 a year, yes, there's an affordable housing sector that is needed. But really where the housing stock is in that 75 to over 150. And again, I'll show these illustrations in just a minute. So I put this little disclaimer down here at the bottom, right? Because I don't want to misrepresent that. It's not like we're not going to do affordable housing anymore. That's not what I'm saying, right? It's that diversified portfolio. Yes, we need affordable housing in our community. Okay. In fact, I'll read this. There's a need for additional affordable housing units for households with income at or below 30% of area median income. The development or preservation of properties to meet, I can't read the rest of that, needs significant subsidies with long-term use restrictions such as community development block grant, home, and housing choice voucher resources provided through the Housing Community Service Department. We're responding to this. In fact, this month, HCS is going to make a presentation on some of the things in and around some affordable housing, right? But let's talk about some of these things can I go to the next slide? So I'm actually going to step away from the podium here for just a second. I know but it really helps to illustrate my point, right? So this is the existing housing stock attainable to income groups. It shows all of these areas across the state, but specifically for Sedgwick County, right? You can't really see it, but this bar is that less than 25, right? It's under 25,000. Yes, there is a gap in that affordable housing sort of unit for those household incomes less than 20. There's a gap. This one was wildly surprising, right? We have almost 30,000 housing units that are available to incomes in the 25 to 50,000. We have another surplus of housing units in the 50 to 75,000, but the gap is in those housing sectors where household family incomes are greater than 75,000. Next slide. This one shows it a little bit differently, but it's also a good illustrator, right? So when we think about the area median income, when you're talking about area median income and affordable housing, you're talking about those incomes that are less than the area median income, right? Is it 80% area median income, 60%, 40%, so on and so forth? For Sedgwick County, we have many units in that section. Where we have a gap in units is really here. Extremely, very interesting, right? Now, you got to take this with a grain of salt, right? This is a little misleading. And we have a pretty good idea why this is a little misleading in the sense that a number of those housing units are probably aging, in need of investment and repair, in less than desirable neighborhoods, right? So this is a little nuanced, right? I don't want to misrepresent these numbers, right? So I think what this tells us is where we're looking for urban infill is here, right? Where we're looking for preservation of existing housing stock is probably here, right? Next slide. So, okay, let's talk about new construction versus preservation of existing housing stock, right? Next slide. So when we talk about new construction, right, one of the reasons why new construction is difficult around housing affordability, right, is because there's a lot of barriers associated with high land and infrastructure costs, high costs of building construction, access to capital with rising interest rates, lenders start to sort of tighten their books, right? Interest rates are climbing, and even more so, qualified buyers become harder to come by, higher rents as a result. So there are obviously barriers associated with new construction, which is why the incentives that we're talking about help close that gap and make these projects more real. Next slide. Preservation of existing housing stock, however, as indicated, the barriers include, we have a lot of aging inventory. Surprisingly, we have a lack of housing variety. We really do, right? We have valuation gaps, right? So one of the things that came out, a lot of the development strategy stuff and just sort of realizations, right? Of if you're in a neighborhood where the median home value is $50,000 and you're trying to build a new home that costs $120,000, that's a $70,000 gap. No lender's going to finance that, right? So even looking at preservation of existing housing stock, if I'm going to try and go make $20,000, $30,000 worth of improvements, am I pricing myself out of the neighborhood? Am I going to be able to obtain that finance? So again, there are some real challenges. Saying that preservation of existing housing stock is going to be easy is not true, right? We have some barriers. Here was an interesting statistic, 2022 census data. Wichita has approximately 175,000 total housing units. We have approximately 158,000 or 91% of our housing units are occupied. 9% of our housing units are vacant. Those seem like pretty reasonable numbers, right? Those actually probably sound like pretty good numbers, 90% occupied, 10% unoccupied. But when you look at the vacancy, that's 15,000 housing units that are vacant, right? And again, that's not just saying that there's a whole background around what vacant means, right? But there's a real opportunity there to respond to a number of our challenges associated with housing, particularly in our ECA, by just trying to address some of the issues we have in and around preservation of existing housing stock and our vacant units. Next slide. Okay, so how do we respond to preservation? We have tools in our toolbox. We have the Affordable Housing Fund, right? We're trying to chisel away using things like AHF. We have things like community development block grant funds, home funds. We can use low-income housing tax credits. We have low-interest loan revolving loan programs. Have the Wichita Land Bank. Next slide. Okay, and then the last conversation, right, as we think about public investment is housing type, right? I've kind of introduced that we need a variety. We need a variety. What does that look like? What does that look like? There's a spectrum of low density versus high density. Next slide. And there was a really interesting, I think we all kind of knew it, but this group actually came out and wrote a whole piece on this and actually illustrated it. Next slide. It's called Missing Middle Housing. And if you want to do research, there's a really great website, missingmiddlehousing.com. And actually, this is not new. In fact, I was thumbing through a bunch of old presentations back when Places for People was being introduced, reviewed, and approved by, and this was in one of those slides, right? So this isn't new. This has been around for several years, right? But I think this does a great job of illustrating the opportunities that exist and where the real kind of want and need really could occur. So again, I'm gonna step away. There's single family residential. And there's two family. Right? That doesn't get it done. Right? What about fourplexes? What about courtyard? What about cottage? What about townhouses? Multiplexes, triplexes, live work units. Coming post-COVID, live work units is absolutely one of the housing types where people can live and work in the same unit, right? You can have a ground floor, upper story owner occupied, ground floor retail opportunity, right? And it's a live work unit, right? These are wildly popular across the US right now, again, particularly coming out of COVID. That doesn't even include sort of the big multifamily residential that we're talking about, right? And when we also kind of emphasize appropriateness to the neighborhood, right? We're not going to put this project here, right? And you're not going to put that project here. There's a gradient and there's a scale about when and where housing types and the density associated are appropriate. Next slide. Okay, so the next couple of slides show, well, okay, I jumped ahead for a minute. Also coming out of that Kansas statewide housing assessment to reinforce kind of some of these ideas, right? These are not anecdotal, right? These are quotes, these are survey results, okay? And these are folks who are in Sedgwick County who are saying, here's what we really want. We want a demand for rental housing variety beyond apartments. Came right out of a survey result, right? Demand for smaller footprint and lower maintenance options. Over the last 2 decades, there's been a limited amount of new construction outside of single family detached homes. Subdivision activity over the past decade has been steady, but many people feel those were only subdivisions and not neighborhoods. Participants noted a need to create more neighborhoods with housing variety and services to create a greater sense of community. Pent-up demand for housing products that meet the need for every stage of life. Right? So I emphasize it's that diversified housing portfolio, right? There's no one housing type, there's no one project that's going to solve all of our problems, right? People are in different stages of life. And we want to have that variety of housing market because we want to keep those folks here, right? You all heard the stories, right? Of how do we keep that next generation of talent here? They're here through high school and then they're off, right? And then we do a really good job, don't get me wrong, of that boomerang type of, they want to come back, which does a great place to raise a family and those kind of things. And so they eventually come back. How do we prevent them from leaving anyway? How do we prevent brain drain from occurring anyway? Creating vibrant, active neighborhoods, communities where we have housing types for all walks of life. And I also want to make sure that I emphasize here too, that I am not suggesting that we stop suburban development, right? That's not what this conversation is about. We need it all. We need the suburban, single family, residential subdivisions, because there is an entire market segment out there that want that. And we have to continue to build that. This conversation is about the ECA, the urban core, taking advantage of the existing infrastructure, getting more density, transit, walkability, all of those kind of things, right? 2 different conversations. We're not suggesting that we're going to get away from single family residential suburbia because we need that too. It just looks different than what we're talking about here. Next slide. So the next series of slides is going to be kind of show you how complex this is and how not every tool will work for every project, et cetera, right? So if you look at just housing price, right? And you look at this Foursquare, right? A publicly funded affordable housing project, right? Looks wildly different than a privately funded housing affordability project, right? Every project is going to respond to various goals and objectives, depending on geography, depending on incentives, depending on ownership interest, investment groups, so on and so forth. Next slide. Same with housing stock, right? A project that is publicly funded a new construction publicly funded project is different than a privately funded new construction project, right? That they achieve different goals and objectives. Next slide. Same with housing type. Right, a high density publicly funded project is going to look wildly different than a privately funded low density project. Next slide. And this just begins to kind of illustrate how complex this is, right? That there's not just one tool, there's just not one project. Every project is unique and requires us to evaluate and understand how that satisfies the goals and objectives of what we're all trying to accomplish. Next slide. So in summary, right, as we have highlighted here, this really is truly one conversation, right? We can talk about affordable housing fund and how the affordable housing fund is responding to affordable housing or housing affordability, right? We talked through the revisions to the implementation program plan. We talked about how that impacts the disposition of Wichita Housing Authority single family homes, preserves that housing stock, gets it back out into the private sector. And then we've also talked about urban infill and a number of our incentive programs, right? We're beginning to differentiate the difference between, are we really talking about urban infill? Are we talking about preservation of existing housing stock? Goals and objectives, right? What are we trying to accomplish? I look back to the strategies and targets laid out in places for people. It's not only geography, but it's performance-based incentives. We have to incorporate housing price, housing stock, housing type in all those conversations. And truly, at the end of the day, this is a public-private partnership, right? We can do sort of 2/3 of this equation, right? But we can't do this without the private sector. And so that's why we're having some really good conversations with the private sector. And we want them back at the table to try and figure out how we can accomplish all of this urban infill. With that being said, that concludes staff's report. And I'll be more than happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Anderson, for a very thorough and well-documented presentation. Before we do any questions, I just would like to note for the minutes that Mr. Hartman joined us approximately 10:20. So do we have any questions of the speaker?
Yeah, I think that research and stuff that you've been working on since you've been here it's great. Compiling some of this. The biggest problem in the world that I do business in is getting everybody to try to understand what there is there that they can basically use. And they try, and in their own mind, one fits all, but that's not true. And that's, you know, it's not only getting the staff or the city to agree to, or not agree to understand it, but also people who want to participate to agree that, you know, you've got to do a specific project for a specific purpose and whatever it might be. Back in the 70s when they did the urban renewal, that was exactly what they did, was they said, we're going to do this, 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 and that. And that's all along the bank of the river over here and everything from here west. So, no, I think you've done a great job.
Thank you. Yeah, as a planner, right? I'm a planner by trade. I American Institute of Certified Planner certification, right? I plan the work and then work the plan, right? That's a classic euphemism isn't around, right? Planning, right? So we're planning that work, right? We've got some really good neighborhood plans. We've got some, and so now we're just trying to work that plan as well, right? It comes in two parts. You're right. There's an educational component associated with this. We got to get out there and we got to educate folks that, hey, look, Wichita's open for business. We want you to come. We want you to invest. I don't care who you are, where you are, you know, we have tools in our toolbox and we want your investment and we want to grow this community. You're right. It takes an educational component along with that. So
environmental is one of the biggest components of getting this infill stuff going.
yeah, absolutely. Environmental plays a key role in a lot of the developments, right? We We work closely with our Public Works and Utility Department, stormwater management, as we start building out more and more development, we start dealing with more and more impervious surface, more stormwater runoff. How do we address that stormwater management, right? So this is a big conversation, right? There's a lot of moving parts and pieces. This is just 30,000 feet. But I gotta tip my cap to our Public Works and Utility Department. They do a great job in helping us better understand the implications of things like stormwater management and environmental impacts for sure.
So I have a comment / question, I guess. So as we look at what you just presented, my concern is that, yes, we want to keep our young people here. We want to keep our longtime people here. We need a diversity of different types of housing. But as we try to provide opportunities for affordable housing that tie into home ownership, because we all know that if somebody rents are going to continue to increase and increase and increase and increase. If we can get somebody to buy, then they're not likely to see the increases like they're going to see in rent. And we certainly have seen that over the past few years. How does what you're talking about feed into actually getting people or opening doors, I guess, for people to buy homes as opposed to renting homes? Because when you talk about townhomes and multifamily homes and duplexes and all those other types of homes, those are rentals. That's not increasing home ownership. And I know our young people want to buy homes. I know some of our people in poverty want to buy homes. Are you telling me that we have sufficient enough stock where we're at for them to be able to buy homes at this point in time?
So I will respond to that in a couple different ways. Number one, I will be the first person to admit, to profess that I agree. Home ownership builds generational wealth, right? I get that. I'm a huge proponent of it, right? With that being said, not everybody wants to buy a home. We are seeing generational shifts in home ownership. In fact, there was a statistic that came out recently that there is some 30% of the population out there right now that when interviewed, they don't want to buy a home, right? They don't want to have to deal with property maintenance. They don't want to have to deal with replacing a water heater. They don't want to have to deal with mowing a lawn. They don't want to have to deal with, they want to be mobile and they want to be flexible. So how do we respond to that? And that's a pretty 30%. That's a third of the population. That's a third of the market segment out there, right? That they don't want to own a home, right? Or they may be just coming out of college. They may not even be able to afford home ownership, right? So how do we continue to respond to those folks? It's a blended approach. It's both, right? I'm not going to rule out home ownership and I'm not going to rule out. Surprisingly, a number of these varying housing types can become home ownership, right? Townhouses, you can buy a townhouse. You can buy a condominium unit, right? There's a lot of communities across the nation that are growing their condominium construction. And I differentiate condominium from apartment in the sense that both are multifamily residential projects. An apartment is a rental project and a condominium is an ownership type, right? And so you can buy a condominium unit, you can buy a townhouse, you can buy a unit within a sixplex, right? And so there are really creative ways to create what we call home ownership, right? It's dispelling that myth that it's this single family residential white picket fence type of product out there. You can buy half of a duplex. You can buy a third of a triplex, right? So you can create home ownership and you can create generational wealth. But the definition of generational wealth is becoming increasingly blurred. And again, we're seeing that across sectors. There's a whole market segment out there that just doesn't want. So how are we responding to all of that? The answer is it's a diversified portfolio, right? We want to have all of those housing types available for ownership. And we also want to see all of those housing types available for rental products as well. we don't want to say that any one product is going to solve our concerns and issues. Does that help?
No, because I'm not really saying that, but if you're telling me 30% doesn't want to own a home, but the other 70% does, do we have the stock to accommodate that other 70% that does? And I know that you say that duplexes can, once somebody can buy a side, and I certainly am familiar with condos and multifamily. We have some areas here in town or some buildings here in town where you certainly can buy like an apartment. I think it's a little bit different than a condo, but I just want to understand that those that want to get into a house, that 70%, we have the stock available to do that. And I think most people that I see that are building duplexes or multifamily aren't building them for the purpose of selling them. They're building them for the purpose of renting them because they can make a lot of money off the rent.
I think to answer your question, the answer is yes and no. Yes, we have some housing stock available for home ownership. Again, there's a lot of barriers associated with that. Existing housing stock, there may need to be significant improvements, kind of we talked about, right? New housing stock, you may not qualify for, right? So every situation is going to be different. So in some respects, I would say, yes, we do have some opportunity for ownership across all housing types, or at least a number of housing types. But the answer is no, in the sense of, no, we don't, right? Which is kind of why we're having this conversation, right? Is we need more of that varied housing type, and we need more opportunities for ownership of that varying housing type. And so, yes, we have some of it, but no, you're right. No, we don't, which is why we're out there trying to educate and encourage more investment in our urban core.
But I think as we continue to invest more in multifamily, whatever that looks like, that's rental properties, the less we're going to provide people an opportunity to actually become home buyers that want to become home buyers. That's just my opinion. Thank you.
Yeah, fair enough. Thank you. Appreciate it.
At this point, I'm going to digress from the agenda. Normally, we ask for any public comments at the end of all of our presentations, but in deference to Mr. Anderson, I see a couple of people here, and I saw one hand that might like to ask a question. If you'd like to ask a question, please go to the podium and state your name and address.
Good morning, everybody. I think I have seen most of you. I've been here before. My name is Gentry Thiessen. I'm the Government Affairs Director with the Realtors of South Central Kansas, and our business address is 170 West Dewey. My question is, I guess there's kind of a couple parts to it, is wanting to know about barriers to getting projects like this done. Is it needing buy-in from people outside of our community, or is it needing buy-in from within the community? And then as far as getting buy-in from within the community, would you say that a bigger barrier is education of the public or political will?
Well, that's a great question. I'll respond to that in the sense of, I think the barriers are education, right? That we have a number of tools in our toolbox that can help bridge the gap. I think there's an educational component around how communities and neighborhoods are evolving, right? We keep kind of talking about that, understanding the environment and context in which this occurs, right? We hear from a lot of those neighborhoods, hey, we're a traditional single-family residential neighborhood. Great, right? On the periphery of that neighborhood, though, is there an opportunity for some of this to occur, right? Oh, yeah, sure. Given the right location and the right project, and absolutely, we would support that type of thing, right? So I think it's an educational component on both ends, that educating those investors, owners, developers, property, that there's an opportunity here. as well as the conversations with the neighbors and the neighborhoods, that if we're going to all achieve what we all hope to achieve, and that's a vibrant, active, growing community as a whole, the city of Wichita, we may have to think differently about how we're seeing that infill and that redevelopment, right? That the traditional single-family residential may not get it done, right? That we still need that in our portfolio, right? But as you saw sort of in some of the survey results, there's a whole market segment and there's a whole population out there that wants something different, right? And so how do we respond to those folks while still being sensitive to the folks who are neighbors, so on and so. So yes, I think it's an educational component. Man, we are in a really interesting environment right now. I kind of hit on some of the barriers, right? Man, investors right now are super skittish, right? They're seeing rising interest rates, riskier and riskier type of projects, inflation, a labor market, right? So there's a lot of barriers associated with new construction. I think I've highlighted a number of the barriers associated with just preservation of our existing housing stock, right? That there are forces in a neighborhood, home values, et cetera, that are impacting homeowners' ability to make improvements, access to capital. Do I price myself out of the neighborhood? Am I getting the return on it? I might go and make $30,000 investment to my home. I want to go to sell, it only adds $10,000, $15,000. Is that really worth my investment? So it's a very complex type of environment out there. And so we want to just kind of look at every single project and see how we can help encourage and promote that infill and redevelopment. But I think it starts with an education. Yep. Thanks.
Are there any other questions or comments from the public, either present or online? Ma'am, would you like to come to the podium? Please state your name and address.
My name's Lee McLeod. You've seen me here before. I live in Benjamin Hills at 2708 West Benjamin. But I am here representing the Wichita Independent Neighborhoods. I'm on that board. And my concern is I'm very interested in what you're doing with the housing issues, but everywhere that people decide to live, they also need to be able to find food. And I'd like to know if not, what the city has been able to do to encourage grocers, let's call them the old-fashioned word grocers, to look at places other than where they are right now. And why are they leaving where they've left? Dillon's is, our predominant grocer. I don't know. Does the city in housing talk to businesses like that? Because not everybody has a car anymore. You're encouraging bicycle riders. I have no clue how people live in the inner city down here and how far they have to go, either on the bus or on a bicycle, if they don't have a car, to get food. And so I hope that you will look into ways that you can reach out to retailers, not just luxury retailers in the lower level of these multi-level buildings, but basic needs folks. Thank you.
Wow, we could probably have a whole presentation around grocers, but to kind of to your question a little bit of, it's a little bit nuanced in the sense that throughout my career, right, I've had a number of opportunities to have conversations in and around grocers, right? Grocers are a unique retail in the sense that in a lot of retail scenarios, right, that sort of the cost per square foot is exponentially higher just because of the volume of inventory and the price points and so on and so. In a grocery store, you don't have that, right? So the price per square foot's associated with grocery stores is drastically reduced. So it's a volume type of conversation, right? And so when you talk about volume in and around grocer, what do you need? Couple components, right? You need demographics with disposable income, you need foot traffic, right? Or you need vehicular traffic, you need a count, right? And so there's kind of a part of, is it chicken or the egg, right? Is, can you convince a grocer to locate in an area, and will then that create more bodies, right? Which then supports the grocer, right? So does the grocer come first and then it supports that? Or does a density of population cause a grocer to locate, right? So a lot of what we've kind of described is an exact response to that, right? Density. How do we encourage density? Because the more dense a neighborhood, the more likely that a grocer will locate, because they know that there is a market segment there, that there's a demographic there that can support that, right? So it's a little bit nuanced of, hopefully we try to find the happy medium of getting to a density where we can now and attract a grocer, and that they both flourish and grow together, right? So yes, oftentimes the grocers that we talk with, right, are freestanding types of, in and of themselves. A lot of the grocer type of product that you may be thinking about too is a tenant in a retail space, right? Is a kind of a smaller footprint type of product that goes more, the smaller the footprint, the more easily they can go into areas that don't have the density that they're looking for, right? And in those scenarios, they're more of a sort of tenant in a retail bay, as opposed to your more traditional suburban grocery store. Yeah, we deal with the grocers, and then we also deal with adults who work directly with grocers. Absolutely, yes, but a lot of it is very market driven. A lot of these grocers, you know, they know down to sort of the exact formula, right? Of once you get this sort of density and you reach this, then yes, right? But if you don't have that density, if you don't have that demographic, then for them, it just, and then otherwise the answer is you're subsidizing it, right? So we've been successful in a handful of scenarios where we've introduced a grocer in an area that didn't meet those metrics, because the development that was occurring, that the grocer was just a small component of it, that the development was subsidizing the grocer and was able to introduce a grocer, and then the neighborhood benefited, but it was only because of the development, right? So yeah, we're definitely having those conversations.
It changed everything.
Oh.
Being able to order online and have your groceries delivered.
Yeah, that's a great point. I was going to mention that too, is post-COVID, the grocery is wildly different, right? Especially in a downtown urban environment, you don't need the great big huge footprint. You have home delivery, they have lockers, you can, the grocer will come and deliver food to a locker, and then you can come to the locker and pull your food out of, I mean, the grocers are finding their way into these markets where the numbers make sense for them.
At the low end.
Fair enough. Yeah, this is just one aspect. You're absolutely right. When you're talking about a lot of the issues that cities touch on, right? Crime, public safety, access to amenities, access to education, access. Yes, there's a whole spectrum of other issues. This is just one 30,000 foot perspective. We have to start responding to a number of upstream issues. Absolutely.
Thank you again, Mr. Anderson, for a very thorough presentation. We appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me. Thank you.
Thank you. Moving on the agenda, right? Scott, you've got 5 minutes.
You bet. Hey, that's why we do this in writing. Highlights on the updates, just to let you know, is that we're looking at case counts that continue to be relatively high. And I think for non-subdivision items will surpass where we were last year. is my expectation. For subdivision items, we continue to see a variable number of subdivisions coming in, but the ones that we do have are getting quite a bit of discussion. But we continue to see that, again, the number of lots that are being created are quite significant. So that is something to keep an eye on, and whether or not we'll surpass last year's is something that we'll be watching. In terms of staff capacity for processing and handling of cases, that is continuing to improve over time. And this one does not report it because a lot of this information appears to be a little bit old, in that this is June information. But when we get you the corrected in July information, what you'll see is that we've hired for a number of different positions, which has been really good for us. So we're starting to see that we're starting to get to a point of full employment, or full no vacancies. Advanced plans continues to be a division where we've got challenges in filling those positions, and we'll continue to work on that. In terms of projects, short-term rentals, the next step is for this to go to the city council. So we're working on scheduling that. The Unified Zoning Code Solar Energy Conversion Systems update, the next step on that will be to bring that to the full MAPC. So we are looking forward to getting that scheduled soon. Nightclub in the city, next step on that is to hold a meeting with nightclub owners. Again, this has not been a front burner issue, but we do want to get that wrapped up before the end of the year. So we know that we've got a limited amount of time to make that happen. Places for people, you just saw a very informational presentation on the incentives that are being offered there. Duplex designs, that continues to be on hold. And I think that that's related to some of the places for people discussion. Public notifications is a new one that's on the list for you. You've seen information about public notification. You've discussed it. I've added it to the list because the city council asked for it to be presented at a workshop, and that workshop was held late last month. Coming out of that, there were a number of council members who asked questions related to sending out the notices in different languages, expanding who receives the notices to be the properties, not just the owners of the properties in the notification areas. And you can see a number of their comments that we've included. It's on page 18. So I would encourage you to look through that. And Mr. Dool, I think we'll be in discussion with you and the future advanced plans chair about when it would be appropriate to schedule an update on this, but also considering how we might address some of the questions that came out of the city council meeting.
Thank you, Scott. Are there any questions of Scott on any of the items that he talked about? If not, then we will stand adjourned. Thank you.